Segregation and discrimination. After the 1866 Reconstruction, African Americans continued to vote, but by 20th century, legal discrimination policies arose. In 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson case established separate but equal doctrine and legalized racial segregation for almost 60 years. The Plessy v. Ferguson case came from a situation where an African American man sat in a white-only section of a car train and refused to move. He was tried and convicted for breaking Louisiana's segregation law. The court ruled that separate but equal facilities did not violate the Constitution. Out of many cases intending to protect African American rights against segregation, it was one of the most important because court used it to create the separate but equal doctrine, which led to segregation continuing for more than half of the 20th century. The poll tax, grandfather clause, and literacy tests are examples of voting restrictions that were imposed. The grandfather clause enabled a person who failed a literacy test or who couldn't afford the poll tax the right to vote if his grandfather or father was eligible to vote before January 1st, 1867. This was before African Americans were given the right to vote, meaning the grandfather clause did not apply to African Americans. The poll tax was a tax that people had to pay in order to have voting privileges. Racial etiquette was informal rules and customs which subjugated African Americans into inferiority. It managed white and black relations, and failure to comply with these customs led to punishment and in some cases death in the form of lynching. African Americans migrated north in hopes of better paying jobs and social equality, but the conditions stayed the same in terms of discrimination and segregated neighborhoods. In the West, Mexicans were paid little to build railroads. They were paid less than any other ethnicity at the time, despite the grueling work. They were vital to mining and agricultural development in the Southwest. Mexicans were forced under debt peonage, which was declared a violation of the 13th Amendment in 1911. Similarly to African Americans in the North, Chinese migrants were forced into segregated neighborhoods. White people feared losing their jobs to Chinese migrants, which forced these migrants into segregated areas. By 1880, there were about 100,000 Chinese migrants in the U.S. In 1902, the National Reclamation Act gave government assistance for irrigation projects, leaving the Southwest area vegetated. State and local laws introduced into the South that enforced racial segregation were known as the Jim Crow laws,